Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon for our discovery series, Cartography in the European Enlightenment. And this is our final session, session 3, Digitization and Cartographic Research. Sorry, I'm trying to move things out of my way and then get to the next screen. Please note that today's meeting will be recorded to share online later, and we will send out an email with a link to the recording tomorrow. You can also find links to the previous recordings on our website. If you haven't joined us for a Zoom session before, we just want to point out a couple of tips. We do like to use the chat. You're welcome to chime in. Select all panelists and attendees so that everyone can participate in the conversation, but you'll notice that the conversation does go by very quickly. So because of that, we ask that you use the Q&A section to ask your questions. There, if you see a question that you also have, you can give it a thumbs up to upvote it. You can also post comments with questions. We have side-by-side mode turned on, so hopefully that's allowing you to see both the speaker and the screen share at the same time. I can only control so much of what you see, so take a moment to adjust as you need to. You can move the separator between the two to change the relative size of each portion. In addition, we do have live captioning turned on as part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion program. You can click on the little CC button to change the settings for that as well, including to toggle it off. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library enables the discovery, learning, and teaching of American history through the collection, conservation, digitization, and availability of primary sources on paper. If you've just joined us, click very quickly to record your poll answer. And I'm going to go ahead and end the polling and share the results. So it looks like 40% of the respondents first had a digital camera, but as we were discussing earlier, some of us started out with our digital media as a scanner or film developed to CDs, mobile phones, or as we were discussing before we started the program, cameras that went directly to floppy disks. So thanks so much, everybody, for participating in that. We're excited to have Mary Pedley and Matthew Edney joining us again this week, along with Karl Longstreth. I'd like to introduce Mary Pedley now. She is the Assistant Curator of Maps at the Clements Library and co-editor with Matthew Edney of the History of Cartography, Volume 4, Cartography in the European Enlightenment. Her research has focused on French and English map makers and map production in the long 18th century. She's been associated with the Clements Library since 1984, and her undergraduate degree is in classical studies, and her PhD is in geography from the University of London. Mary, I'm happy to turn it over to you now.
Great, thanks so much, Angela, and thank you, everybody, for those of you who are returning again to this third part of our series on Volume 4 of the History of Cartography, and to those of you who are joining us just for today's session. Very glad to have you all with us. Of course, I'm really pleased to introduce my old friend and colleague and co-editor of Volume 4 of the History, Matthew Edney. Matthew is the director of the History of Cartography project at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And at the same time, he teaches in the Department of Geography and Anthropology at the University of Southern Maine, where he holds the Osher Chair in the history of cartography. He's the faculty scholar at the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education, and is broadly interested in the nature and history of maps and mapping. And I can highly recommend to you his website, mappingasprocess.net, as a guide down the many highways and byways of his current research. And our special guest today is Karl Longstreth. Karl is the map librarian in the Clark Library, which is part of the University of Michigan's graduate library that holds the university's map and atlas collection. Karl helps to develop that collection, especially in the history of cartography, and make those collections available to a broader audience, building on his own interests that focus on history, the sciences, Eurasia, and the use of geographic information systems in the science and humanities. His formidable technical talents allow him to help students and faculty with spatial data for analysis and mapping. And for this program particularly, he has been one of our go-to providers of digitized images for Volume 4 of the History of Cartography. So I welcome you both today. And as I set the stage for Karl, I'm sure you in the audience are wondering why we are turning to the subject of digital imagery in a volume that concerns mapmaking in the long 18th century. So to do this, to answer that question and set the scene for Karl's work, I turn once again to the two book covers of Volume 4, Cartography and the European Enlightenment, only to note that both of these cover images come from digital images. The one on the left, a printed map by Peter van der Aa from 1713, that came to us by courtesy of Barry Ruderman, a map dealer in La Jolla, California. The one on the right, a manuscript image, is the illustration, is the title page of Adam Zerner's Atlas Augusteus Saxonicus. This image, because it's a manuscript, is rare, and it comes to us from the Hauptstaatsarchiv in Dresden. So we have two printed map, manuscript image of both of them we are able to put on the cover as digital images. As you can imagine, the History of Cartography series of reference books naturally requires many, many, many images of maps. The first 3 volumes required images that relied on photography, and most of that photography came in black and white. With color, when it was possible, was produced on plates in what we call gatherings in different sections of the book. And so color images were often separated from the text that they accompanied. But as we approach the 2010s, and we're looking at the publication of the last 3 volumes, 4, 5, and 6, it became possible to produce the volumes in color throughout, and the results were dramatic. Turning to a map that those of you who were with us last week, that Gottfried Hagen talked about, and when he talked about Ottoman mapping, that map by Ressa Mustafa of the Ottoman-Polish border was published in 1992 in volume 2 from a black and white photograph. We republished it again, another copy of the map from a different archive, in 2019 in volume 4 in full color from a digital image. And I think you can see here what the contrast and the ability of the reader to look more carefully at this map was made possible by digitization. So I'm going to ask Matthew to join me here and talk briefly about how this came about, how it was that we went from publishing in black and white to color. What were the circumstances that made that possible?
It was actually very straightforward. On the one hand, there's the intellectual issue that as you move into the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, color actually comes to bear significant meaning. Just think of a geological map or a map of population density. it'd be very, very useful to show all maps in color for those volumes, given that intellectual weight that color serves in modern mapping. But at the same time, the number of maps being produced, number of reproductions of maps we're getting from archives that were scanned or digitally photographed rather than photomechanically photographed started increasing dramatically. So for volume 3, which came out in 2007, there is never going to be a volume 7. I must stress that point. For volume 3, out of the well over 1,000 images in the book, 1 was delivered as a digital file. All the rest were black and white photographs or ectochrome transparencies for the color. Which also requires that when you apply to libraries to get copies, you need to be able to say, oh, can we do this as a black and white, or can we do this as a color transparency? Which gets a bit problematic in the production process. But because libraries move very rapidly to digital provision of images, we could tell the press that we would do all the work in processing the images, so that all they would have to do is take the image that we would provide, already cropped, already sized to either the column width or the page width or broadside, and they would just have to literally just plop it into the digital file as they flowed to text. They wouldn't have to go through any of the complex process of turning these hard copy images into digital images or strip them into the negatives for printing, whatever the process may have been. And then the cost of color printing had come down enough overall. So the press agreed. And so the last 3 volumes will be all color. And well, 2 and the third, last one will be as well. And what that also means for Mary and I, when we were editing volume 4, is we didn't have to worry early on in the process about which maps should be color, which map should be black and white. And we could really editorially curate the images and relate them to the content of the entries much more effectively than I think earlier volumes had to do. So all around, it's just a change of technology, change in cost, change of process, makes a much better volume.
And these changes in technology and process are really parallel to one of the themes that we looked at in our first session about the context of map making. And in a way, this is also a context of bookmaking, and that's the methodology of how it is that you produce a map and how do you reproduce a map. Just as Matthew has outlined that the methods of production had changed in terms of book production, so in the 18th century were maps reproduced, as you remember, from copper plate, from engraving and etching on copper plate and being printed by a rolling press. And this was the same method used to reproduce maps that came from an earlier period, as you see in this image from Vol 4, figure 370, which is a facsimile. It's engraved on copper plate, but it's a facsimile of the Poitinger map, which was a Roman map of the world. This engraving is of a 12th century copy of a lost 4th century Roman map. So copper plate engraving was used in the 18th century. In the 19th century, lithography was used for reproducing older maps. In the 20th century, of course, photography was used. And if you remember the map that Gottfried Hagen showed us last week from the Clements Library, the world map by Haji Ahmed, excuse me, which was originally produced from wood blocks, reprinted in 1795 in Venice, and then reproduced by Karl Longstreth with a scanner for the talk that was given a week ago. And with that, I can turn the share screen over to Karl to help us learn a little bit more about this 20th century technology and how it becomes important for reference books like ours. Karl, I'll stop sharing here and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mary. So is this visible to everyone?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So in the image you saw before of the scanning of the Venetian print, then you saw an image of that map on the bed of this particular scanner. And here is an image again of it showing where I'll talk through the components of the scanner. It's a machine made in France. Many of the best scanners are made in France or in Germany, but other places as well. And it's a planetary line scanner. That means that the camera and the lamps move over the top of the object that you're scanning, which lie on a bed, such that you don't have to manipulate them, turn them over on other kinds of scanners. And it's a safer way to handle than the object. And it has interesting components, which I'll talk through here. So this protrusion carries the lamps, which then light the image as the scanner moves across this flat bed. In the back is a carefully is a system of motors and then rotating a rotating spiral, which then moves this arm in a very rigid, precise way. And it's very fixed because you don't want the objects vibrating. You don't want the arm vibrating. And then as the scanner moves across, up here is the assembly of the camera, a lens on that, and another view of this. So here, so just like any camera, it has a lens, and the lens remains the very, very important component of any kind of camera system. After, well, in the early 19th century, some English opticians and lens makers began trying to make lenses which were apochromatic. They produced color. They produced color the same as the object that you were seeing. So first, for optical instruments, telescopes, microscopes. Later then, when photography comes out, this idea of correctly producing the image from one side of the lens to the film and now the digital camera was extremely important. So much the concept in the use of a lens is to make the image as flat as possible, to eliminate distortion, and to correctly reproduce the color that you're seeing. So on the side of the scanner, you see it has an image that relates to the size of the photoreceptor, which is a circuit board-like looking object in this with lots of other computer components and chips. And there's a tiny array of 3 grids, all of which contain photoreceptors, one set sensitive to red, one set sensitive to green, the other sensitive to blue. And if you take a prism or have done this, you split light, sunlight, white light, and you can then project a spectrum of light from that. And most principal color that we visualize can be then produced with red, green, and blue. So that a great saturation of red, green, and blue return white light. no return of any light at all is black, what we call black. And then some balance of those things in between produce other colors. So here then the machine is ready to run. On the right side are the lamp controllers. And just beyond that, out of the scene then is the computer. And so as this machine runs, then it picks up the image. So I have a color target, which you see here. And that's very important because it helps then the computer to then correctly interpret the image and the colors and the balance of color that it sees, variations in the kind of light, changes in things with the lens and aperture opening, the distance then that the object is from the lens may affect then the color. So you want something that establishes a standard for this. And we make those usually each day that we scan. This object is kept in the dark, but over time, even the stable colors in that can change, so they need to be replaced. What I'm scanning here is something acquired just a couple of weeks ago, and it's two manuscript maps of cities in France. And I'll come next to the one on the right in that image, and then here's the scan of this, and it's a plan, manuscript plan of the city of Tournai from 1691. Tournai will come up again later in the conversation. So why do we scan these works? Well, the obvious thing is to have the image. Images that were put into the History of Cartography project, images for faculty, students, and others to use in their teaching and research, in publication, in illustration, of course. They may be primary sources. So something like this, maybe someone studying fortifications, or it may illustrate something about a place in time where someone's writing or drawing on other kinds of sources. So then potentially secondary. It captures for us an image of an object. We have a map, a book, an atlas, a globe, an instrument with a high degree of fidelity. And we often take both the front of the object and the back of the object. And if there are interesting details which require more enlargement, we may take another image of that. If there are watermarks or other features of the paper, we may then transmit light through that and record that kind of information. Almost every printed map well into the later 19th century is distinct because the paper is different. Things are aligned and set on it differently. The ink makes a different impression. The color may be different and change. There may be annotations or other things which we can record. So it is a digital surrogate of the actual object, which then we can clearly identify our copy against other kinds of copies. So then, of course, there are many other reasons to scan. You can, I'm sure, think of many. But key in this is to have an object which then with high resolution and using softwares in computers, even on your camera, you can zoom in and out. And with an image of high resolution, it essentially acts like a macroscope, a microscope, to then look in greater detail at a particular object. So that was a flat, perfectly flat image that lays flat on the bed of the scanner. Here is an atlas, and one that was used in the History of Cartography, Volume 4. This is the Turgot-Bretet plan of the city of Paris. This, the sheet that has Notre Dame way up in the corner of that. So the top bed comes off of this, and these things, atlases and other works, books, then rest on a couple of plates which move up and down to allow you to then adjust its height, and ideally back again in the plane of where that original then bed was. And on the right, you see a little object with a light on it, and that's the controller that moves the two plates up and down, seen here in this next image. So you can put very large objects on this, And indeed, we've done some very large objects, which we'll see next. And it can support a book or an atlas of considerable weight. And many of you know, many books and atlases can be quite large. This particular scanner can take an image of about 1 meter by a little over a meter by about 800 centimeters. So a fairly large image can be captured with it. So here is an atlas done using that bed. It's a work from the Clements Library, a Spanish edition, unusual, of Frederick de Witt's Atlas of the World. And we captured this for a scholar working on this, and all the images are through it. Just one of the maps. I also captured using this with an array of supports and using those, using the table that supports atlases to then also reproduce the binding of this work. So on the left, we have the front cover, the foredge, the back cover, and then the spine of the work. This is very useful to capture the entire object. And useful for those who are studying the binding of these kinds of things. So it's very useful to be able to do that. Now, much of our scanning here, and we do scanning of our own collections, other collections on campus. The Clements also uses this particular machine to do its own scanning, or we sometimes work together to do that, as in the Venetian Ottoman map done for Gottfried's talk. Here's an object in our collection, which is reproduced, but not this particular one, in the History of Cartography volumes. And this is a large, then, set of all of the Cassini map of France, an important work, really the first topographic map. The beginning illustration for this presentation today was the first really the first attempt to make an accurate topographic map centered on Paris and done in the 1670s. And that reproduced copy in color comes from the one in our collection, which was acquired in my tenure here. So then in the 19th century, in about 182 images or 182 prints, the Cassini family then completed the topographic map of France. And here is the entire map, all 182 pieces, assembled together from David Rumsey's copy, which he scanned. His copy is a folio atlas, so each of the prints has a fold down the middle. But after scanning it using his computer technology, he then assembled it into one image. You really can't tell any detail in this, but you do see the outline of France in this. So this is something that can be useful, especially if you scale into this, because you can see adjacent sheets together and you can sort of understand the landscape over a larger area than just that small topographic map of a particular place. And this then are the sheets around Paris. And then here is the image of David's then Paris sheet, the very first one done for the atlas, and following the model of that one done and printed in the 1670s. So, and then here's the detail of Paris, this then from our copy of the same atlas, showing some detail of the city around Paris. So it's useful to have multiple copies of these things. With the work, the image just before, you see that they're printed in different ways. They don't match up entirely correctly. But if you have enough copies of these, you can start to sort of assemble ones which have maybe the best printing and the best image. And in my effort to acquire works for our collection, I'm often looking for the best copy of something that we can have, certainly. Now, here's another copy of the Cassini plan. And this is probably a more common way that those maps were used. You would go in a shop, you would acquire one or several. Possibly it was dissected and mounted already for you, or you would have this done. If you go out and do work, you're in the field, you're using this in some way. Carrying around an atlas is impossible, and even carrying around a set of rolled maps might be kind of difficult. So dissected maps became a very common way to make a map very usable. And here's a group of then the same dissected kind of maps, all Cassini works. These come from a particular owner, or two owners, General Henry and General Sir William Henry Clinton, the sons of Henry Clinton, whose papers are at the Clements Library, and many important manuscript maps and other works that relate to the American Revolution. So a foundational collection in the Clements Library for the study of American history, and indeed many other kinds of histories. This set from the Sons collection is here in the Clark Library, another story behind that. And these were works which they acquired and used then in their military and diplomatic service. These two sets, the one then on the left of Paris, that first sheet, and very importantly, Lille, because the Lille sheet of this includes that city, Tournai. And this belonged to the younger of the sons, Henry, who was stationed, and his headquarters was Tournai. He acquired these maps then from a dealer in that city at that time, and he likely used them to understand the area just before the conflicts that led to the Battle of Waterloo, in which he played a prominent role. The other two maps, probably used in the Peninsular campaigns by one or the other of the Clinton sons, and then each were purchased at a different shop in Paris. So we have the labels of those things. So it's terribly useful to understand the object and its formats, how it was used, presented. Does it have a little slip case in it, as one of these does? And now with digital photography, it's much easier to capture these quickly and steadily, and you don't have to worry about dealing with many photographic processes of plates or film, black and white or color, and working in a dark room and reproducing these kinds of things. So that's terribly, terribly useful. So we also particularly like to see maps, and Mary and Matthew mentioned having things in color. These are not in color, but they reveal then again this distinction between a map that's been dissected for use, but then a map in sheets. And both of these fairly recently acquired. This then Maps of Paris by Jaillot, the one in the background, it has a little fold in it, but it's essentially a sheet of paper with its decal edges. It was never trimmed. It was never put in an atlas. This is a great thing to be able to scan and digitize because you don't have to worry about assembling its little parts from the dissected map that you see. In addition, we have an assembled copy of this, which actually has been colored as well. So that adds another dimension. And there are various reasons to use those particular things. The color in some of these, of course, as Matthew said, has meaning. In other cases, not always. So I'd like to come to the things that become a little more difficult. We've scanned a lot, I would say, of the easy things. Now we're dealing with the more difficult things. Here, this is an immense map of the Canal du Midi in the south of France, a major engineering project. A set of assembled sheets in a scroll-like form. There are 5 of these, and the thing stretches, I think, about 15 or 20 meters in length. This we can capture by putting a glass plate in this or using a similar scanner with the image held down, if possible, the vacuum table, or again, a glass frame that then supports it. And you scan part of it, roll that part back up, scan more. So somewhat simple. More complex are folded maps, which have come to us in this way, where we want to capture what that object looks like. It's really great when a dealer lets us purchase, or these which came via auction. The map, unsophisticated, it hasn't been flattened out, conserved, mounted in some way, put behind glass. We have the original work. And in this case, these belong to a man named Samuel Sitgreaves here with his writing on it. And he acquired this map in 1800 in the city of Utrecht, and it's a plan of the city of Utrecht. A whole nother story about Samuel Sitgreaves. In that image also was a plan of the city of Ghent on very heavy paper, again, a huge sheet, and very stiffly folded up. If I remove the weight in this and hold my fingers in the right place, this map will actually fold itself up. Literally, the lower part will fold up onto this, the upper part will fold down, and then the two outer flaps then usually will fold correctly in on each other. So it's rather an automatic map. Once we conserve this, we will have lost that. So there's a decision to be made here. And probably what we'll do is we'll try to film this. We'll take many images of the object as it is, and then hopefully preserve that sort of information about it. Here's the map then out just laying on the scanner. And I've only opened it a few times because I don't really want to damage it very much. And then here's an initial scan done of it before then. It will later go on to conservation work to be conserved and used, certainly. Then books and atlases, fairly easy if they're not complicated in some way. This is a set of histories of the city of Paris. And the books are pounded. That is, the text blocks have things in them and the text blocks are pounded around those. So you see the foredge of two of the volumes just looks like pages. But if you open one up, it flips open to a group of then maps, which are intricately folded and pounded in here to text block. You see the imprint of the map on the right side of this. And it's a very interesting way of binding, well, assembling and binding a work. Makes scanning the object difficult. Here then, this particular map unfolded, we will have to do a great deal to then flatten this carefully, support it, lower the glass plate onto it, keeping the edge of the book outside. So it suddenly becomes a great labor then to image these kinds of things in the books. But it's important enough and the copy is good enough that we would not want to disbind it, scan things that way. There are certainly works where we have done that and then reassembled them as well. Some objects don't really lend themselves to good reproduction at all. Here, celestial work with a series of volvels. We can capture the image, but really this is an object that needs to be worked. It's an instrument. You want to turn the dials, understand the measures that it's making, maybe make some calculations from this. And these are fabulous and interesting objects, but they don't lend themselves to imaging in the way that we do with these scanners. So this is the front of a pop-up or peep show of the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. You see a little circular hole, which if you pulled the object apart, you would peer through that and see sort of a 3D rendering. This is impossible to image because it would have to be deassembled so that you could capture each part of it. So it's something where the technology of imaging it defeats what we may wish to do with it. So, and then lots of multiple things that are shiny. Again, here, a set of the first topographic map of England in rather elaborate boxes. That was a presentation set. And then here, these things with the pull-off case. And you see the maps then sticking out of the top and one just laid out here. So something, again, we want to capture all these parts of an object and obtain then, of course, the maps themselves and scan those eventually. We haven't done this work yet. Here's a marvelous one in conversation that Matthew Edney shared, this from the Osher collection at the University of Southern Maine, where Matthew is. It's a Slater set of maps assembled in these marvelous little slip cases, each with an elaborate black and white cartouche-like title, I believe, on this, and then put together and put into another pull-off case with nice calf and tooling and a rather lovely then marble marble paper inside the work and on the telescoping top of the tube. So fascinating kind of thing, I think, and useful to capture the maps, but then the maps as they were assembled and used. And so digital photography, digital scanning makes doing this much easier. Early in the conversation, then I mentioned images of David Rumsey and the Cassini map of France. This is the first big atlas from our collection that was scanned in the early 90s before we had the scanner that we have currently. And David Rumsey did the work for this. It's a big plan of St. Petersburg in an atlas with many views. My only work to do this was to fly it out to San Francisco, where David and his marvelous setup for scanning works then did the entire atlas, then assembled the maps into one image. Here you see of this work, and then made this then available through his website. You can see that it came from the University of Michigan, but we're very happy to have it out there for people to use. So now we provide some of these same kind of images this way. And ultimately, many institutions are then putting these up in websites, as David Rumsey does, as we do here with our image server for the Clements Library, Clark Library, Special Collections Library, and other parts of the university as well. And David was one of 250 contributors to images for the History of Cartography project. So those 900 images then came from 250 different individuals, some collectors, dealers. Barry Ruderman was mentioned early on, and indeed many institutions, including the University of Michigan, which provided a great deal of many images, the Bibliothèque Nationale and others as well. So I think I'll end at this point and turn off my slides, and we can go on to questions to all the panelists. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karl, not only for this introduction of the how scanners work and the why of digitization, the complexity of the work of digitizing. It's not just slapping a map down in a scanner and pressing the go button. And it gives us as editors a chance to let our audience know that behind every digitized image that you ever look at, whether it's in a book or on the screen, there's been a lot of physical labor that's gone into that in terms of getting objects to a scanner, in terms of the care with which they're handled before they can be scanned, and in the processing and curating of the information about the images. And these factors all played out back into when, as we apply some of what we've learned now to how we applied these aspects of digitization to the images in volume 4, Matthew mentioned that editorial control that digitizing allowed us in the curation of the illustrations. So we just have 2 or 3 examples from the volume to show you how digitization not only works in the volume itself, but how it works for you as a reader and researcher using the volume. So I'll just go back to my screen again and pick up with where we left off with Karl at the scanner. There he is. and turn to this map. In 2 sessions ago, we used this map of Italy by Donville as a way to explain how geographical maps were compiled. This is the map as it looks on the screen. This is the map as it looks on the printed page of volume 4. And I particularly want to point out not just the map, but the caption underneath the map. I mentioned captions when we were looking at the cover, and captions are something we spent a good deal of time on preparing in the volume. A caption not only provides the name of the map, the author, the date, and how it's connected to the text, but it also gives you the size of the original. As you could tell from Carl's presentation, when you see a map on your screen, all maps look the same size. But knowing the size of the original gives you some sense of how this map is reduced on the page. The caption also tells you the source of the image, and in every place possible, we give you the call number or the shelf mark. That means you as a reader can go to the institution in its website and find the actual image in the institution's image bank. In this case, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And you can find a zoomable image, and by pushing on the zoom down here, you can actually see the image in great close-up. So you have a good deal of agency also in using these images. Our having a high resolution allowed us as editors to choose details for images, as Matthew will join me in explaining on this next one, the image that we showed you in the first section for topographical surveying. Matthew.
So when you have such a large map as this one, and to be honest, I'm not quite sure what the original size was, but you can see from the writing at the bottom. Thank you, Mary. Perfect. Over 1.5 meters high by 88 centimeters wide. It's very hard to read the details, and frequently what's important about a map are the details, the particular way relief is shaded on this map, and the kinds of features that are being represented. And so Mary and I were able to go into the digital images, read the text that accompanies them, and figure out, do we want to show the whole map? Do you want to show detail? And if so, which particular detail? And you can see in the end, we went for a 1 column wide, but rather tall detail, trying to capture it as much as size, to give the impression of the nature of the work, not of the map as a whole, but of the quality of the topographic mapping that went into it. And in other cases, if the material survive, then we can do interesting things like this. The Peter Dam, the author of the entry on the Venus Skyscraper-kort, if I could pronounce that in Danish, basically the Academy of Sciences map series. The Danish authorities today have still on the left, the detailed manuscript plans that were made in the field. And on the right, we have the much reduced printed version. And Peter suggested that we use 2 details showing the town of Oder on Zeeland. I think that's where he's from. So, and we were happy to oblige, because you can see on the left the construction lines that the surveyors are using to control the survey, as well as the details, which actually copy quite neatly into the printed map in some respects.
Matthew, Carl's presentation also made us very aware that we need to be thinking about different aspects of the original when we're looking at digital images. And what are some points that any scholar needs to be aware of when they use digital images in studying old maps or even recent maps on the screen?
Well, the first thing Karl, I think, demonstrated very nicely, which is when you have an image on the screen, it doesn't matter whether it's a wall-size map that's being shrunk down to the screen or a little bitty thing that's being blown up to the screen. It's very, very easy to lose track of the size of the original, and size of these maps is really important in understanding how they were used and how they were read and so forth. So at a bare minimum, it's always important to have a sense of the size of the original. And that's one of the reasons why we've always, in the History of Cartography project series, always had the size of the originals as part of the caption. It's something David Woodward was particularly persnickety about and insisted that we always do for very good reasons. All of the images here are about the same height, 7 or 8 inches. But we could easily have accidentally mixed in with this a bigger atlas, and the reader would have said, oh, it's about the same size as all the other ones, just because each one is being sized to fit the page. The other thing in this, the imaging is very important to do, and again, Karl comes up with this very, very nicely, is really important to keep track of the physical form of an image. We already saw this with the difference between color, losing color in a monochrome environment makes colors look rather a bit muddy at times. Keeping color is great because that's an integral part of the form. How maps are folded is a wonderful example of a self-folding map. How they fit into a book, and anybody who's done any kind of work in map history will tell you that as soon as you go into Google Books or any of the large collections, Europeana and others, where they have books image and you can page through the book, you get to that folded map. And because the book has been imaged in an automatic process, where they're using puffs of air to turn the pages, and after each puff, pause, photograph, puff, photograph, is all automated, and then the folded up maps just get puffed over. And so you have beautiful pictures of the folded map from one side and from the other side, but no idea of the map itself. To do the map requires folding it out with all the care that's involved. It requires resetting the camera. And then you've got to have that post-production hassle of fitting the image within the network of the sequence of pages. It's much more complex. And so some institutions focus on rapidity, in which case you lose the sense of the images that are in the book, or you have to spend a lot more time being a lot more careful in pre-production, production, and post-production of the photographs to capture the form. And it goes to the bindings, it includes imaging blank pages as well as pages of content so that you can understand how the nature of this book, let's say the book was put together. Backs of items are really important. There's always lots of information on the back of an item. So no matter how good a photographic image is, my rule of thumb is always, if you can go and see the original, see the original. And you'll always find something that doesn't quite get it into the digital image or into the catalog record.
I think a final thing too we need to remember is that digital images on a library's website are not all the maps that a library has or any institution. That very often the digital images only scratch the surface of the total number of maps and atlases that are available. So using a library's catalog, using any catalog reference that's available to us is another thing we should remember, that there are many, many maps out there that are not imaged.
Let me just interject. There's something we didn't have in our notes here, Mary.
Yes.
Karl's talk brings out very nicely that just because one institution has imaged an item doesn't mean that other institutions shouldn't then image the same work, because whether it's been folded, dissected, put into a wall map format, kept in atlas format, whatever it may be, whether it's been annotated, colored, when you get down to it, even in machine press period, 19th and 20th century, every image is different in terms of the physicality of the work. And so we need to not only image more items, but also not worry about duplication, because
And
duplication
I
is less productive.
totally agree. In fact, when you have an item, as we do in the library, you'll have an item that it says it's only known in 3 or 4 institutions. It's really helpful to have images from all those institutions from a research point of view and from a curatorial point of view to compare. And you inevitably find interesting and small differences.
As Alex Clausen found, there you find fakes as well.
Right.
Mhm.
So I do want to be able to open things up for questions. I want to thank both Matthew and Karl again for joining me in this series of conversations about the nature of maps and mapping in the European Enlightenment and how to produce a book about it. So thank you all very much for being here today with us.
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
We have lots of questions, many of which are technical. So I think I'll start off. Andrew was wondering what the resolution is at which you normally scan.
So the standard for maps and similar images is 400 pixels per inch. This scanner, we do them at 418. You see the images from Rumsey's site and many at that resolution. Sometimes that's insufficient. So we will scan at higher resolutions depending on the detail in a particular object, using other scanners or resetting this particular machine. And on flatbed machines, we can go up to 1200 parts per inch, but not an image that's a 1.3 meters by 800 centimeters. 80 centimeters. We will be acquiring a newer scanner sometime with more components to it that should allow us to more easily then change the resolution on these machines, on our scans.
Thank you. Thanks. Tom is wondering, can you eliminate all spherical distortion with an optical lens?
No, they're depending on the size of the lens and then how large an object you're capturing it can essentially disappear. But you always get to a point where the object is too distant, and that becomes a problem. That can often be corrected, of course, with software and with adjustments that in that way. But really, just because of the nature of how a lens works, it's essentially not possible. If you're going to make an immensely large lens, then the amount of distortion goes away. Okay.
Thank you. So Douglas is, and you talked about this a little bit, but since atlases don't completely lie flat, do you attempt to correct for the curvature near the central fold?
Often. That's something we can do with some works where the map can be made to lie fairly flat, and then a glass plate can be lowered in a frame on it and supported that way. One of the things I've certainly discussed with others, David Rumsey is certainly for this, is that you don't necessarily want to make something completely flat unless there's a compelling reason. Certainly these atlases, the Turgot, you can read everything in the work very clearly, but you may want to have it completely flat because you're doing some other kind of analysis with it, or incorporating it into a geographical information system where you want to reduce the amount of distortion that you have to try to make up for in measuring or indeed digitizing the information in the work and putting it into other software like a geographic information system.
Thank you. All right, so the next one deviates from the technical, and Tom is asking, are the very original Cassini maps preserved at particular locations?
Yeah, they're in the, well, depends what you mean by the original Cassini map. So if you mean the copper plates or if you mean the manuscript maps that they're based on. But most of that material is I believe in the IGN in Paris. The IGN is the Institut Géographique National in Paris, and I think they have a wonderful website of where they have themselves digitized most of the Cassini material. So that's definitely worth having a look at if you're interested in those maps.
Thank you. Ron is wondering how you deal with reflection from shiny objects.
Okay, that can be very difficult, especially if the shiny object is not a completely smooth surface. So some of those works which have gold leaf on them can be very, very difficult to do. Sometimes the scanner will do an okay job, but usually those are things that require digital photography, requires lighting through a cloth tint, or even sometimes something I've used is large sheets of crumpled aluminum foil, which can reduce tiny little shiny spherical dots that appear on a complex shiny object. So when you're really trying to capture the fidelity of something like that, that's a serious effort in making a photograph or a digital photograph.
Interesting. Thank you. Doug is wondering, does your scanner perform white balancing or color correction in its process, or does an operator need to do the correction?
Newer software that operates this machine with a color target, you can do some programming to let it do that. But with the diversity of the size of the images we have, we do an individual one, we correct that ourselves, but we do have processes where we do it in a batch format, adhering to a particular set of procedures. And there is software specific for some types of color targets that helps one do that.
Thank you. And Karen's wondering, can you use raked lighting to pick out score type marks on manuscript maps with that big scanning machine?
Yes, by lighting, you can turn one set of lights off and light from one side. The newer machine we hope to acquire will allow you to do a better job with that. But again, sometimes just because of the nature of the object, you may then have to set up lights and a different kind of digital camera and really pour the light evenly across the surface and pick up that kind of thing. So again, that can be a labor intensive, but a terribly, terribly interesting way to acquire information.
Right. Michael is wondering, is the Clements Library doing any hyperspectral scanning of maps, manuscript or other, for analysis?
To my knowledge, no, but many here on campus have an interest in doing that kind of thing. We mentioned the visible spectrum, red, green, and blue, of course, but there are all kinds of things that you can capture across the electromagnetic spectrum. Much of this work has been done with interesting, complicated manuscript works to try to understand pigments and colors. There is a great study done by the French engineer and Pascal Cotte, who did the work to image the Mona Lisa in a multispectral, hyperspectral ways. And there are a lot of projects that use this kind of thing and trying to look at paintings, maps, and manuscript materials and to understand then components in them. Even analysis, which allows one to go behind the paint or the layers or other components of the work. So it's a fascinating area. We probably do have objects here, which that it would be useful to be able to do that. It's expensive.
All right, Victoria is asking the question that I asked in our dress rehearsal. Do most of your digitized images link to archives that have the images online?
We don't have the actual hyperlink in the caption. We just have the name of the institution and the call number. And I'm afraid you have, as a reader, you have to take it from there. Different institutions place their digital images in their various image banks in different kinds of ways. Most of them do a link from a catalog entry to the digital online image, and you can get at it that way. But we made a conscious decision at the time we were preparing the volume. Most of those URLs were not necessarily stable, and we weren't sure if they would still be working when the volume came out in print. Matthew, have I captured that pretty much as we discussed it? Because that was a big question.
I mean, we have a problem with URLs anyway. If somebody cites a book that's on a work that's online, digitally born, because URLs have a habit of dying and disappearing. So it's much easier to send people to an institution that hopefully will still be there, even if the website gets completely redone and the interface is completely redone. Rather than trying to give everybody that information.
So the most stable information was the institution that from which we received the image and the shelf mark or call number of that image, because that's how the curators in that institution can find the original thing. And then, so with that, every caption has its source.
And Victoria then sort of follows up, but I think you've answered it. You wouldn't want to link those digitized images to your own website then, because
no, and the institution has the copyright too on those images too. We had to apply for permission to use them in the book.
Right. So Jim is asking, when cataloging or writing captions, how do you measure size? Edge to edge, neat line to neat line, both? What do you do with an irregular sheet?
Well, every library with maps, usually the form is height by width, of course. But every librarian, I have to say, every institution has their own little ways of measuring. Usually it's the printed contents that get measured, not the sheet, because the sheet can be trimmed. And Karl gave a good example of that, the Jaillot plan of Paris that still had the décollage around the edge. So you usually do the printed surface, and that sometimes can be beyond the neat line of the map itself. But that's pretty much, you measure the printed part.
Yeah.
With an irregular sheet, you measure the irregularity if you can.
If it's printed and if it's a copper engraved printing, so you have a plate mark, then some people will measure the plate mark, but again, they are sometimes trimmed off. So the only things really trustworthy and consistent is the limits of the printed image.
And that makes me think that with manuscripts, I think we measure the sheet in manuscript maps. I'd have to look at our cataloging.
And I will just say that some people want to measure paper maps to the nearest millimeter, but over history, over time, with temperature change, humidity change, papers shrink. The production process may require an expansion of the paper in tallow printing, copper plate. The paper is slightly engrossed, and then as it dries, it shrinks a bit. So over time, you can't guarantee that every single impression is going to be the same precise size, because the paper is going to vary over time. So the rule of thumb I learned is, record to the nearest ½ centimeter. Anything more than that is wasted precision.
I'd agree.
Nope.
That was a complicated
Mm-hmm.
answer.
Mhm.
So Frank is wondering if sometimes the maps need to have some conservation to bring out the original clarity before digitization.
Yes, certainly. If a map is particularly dirty, if it has, some problems like that, if the folds are damaged, and parts of the image are separated, we will try to image that and then have conservation work on it, to return it to as close a state as is reasonable, in that. We generally will not restore color in works that had been colored, but sort of take the object as it is. If something is displaced on the map, a tear, a fold that's folded over, and it's possible to then put that part of the map back correctly in place, then we will have that done and then image the work again.
Right. So you're saying you would image it both before and after?
Generally now, with the ease of digitizing works, we commonly will then scan the object as it is, and then image it after it's been conserved, sometimes in several stages.
Mhm. All right. Tom's wondering, could a three-dimensional map be captured with a hologram?
It could be theoretically, I suppose. There's actually a couple of different ways. We've been playing with digitizing of globes, and there are a couple of ways in which that's being done. The way that we do it in Maine is to treat it as a video. And in effect, what we do is we image about 240 photographs for each top and the bottom, so about 480 photographs in total. And we do it with a digital camera, which has some macro lens, a zoom macro lens, so you have very good depth of field. So the portion you're looking at, you've got that curve, that sense of curvature. And we do it with a machine that has a very precise geometry, so you know how all these little bits fit together. And so you can either, if you're interested as a scholar, just beg us and we'll give you the flat image. Or if you want to look at it online, essentially it gives you what our photo guy, Dave Nykerk, calls a sophisticated flip book. So it looks like you're rotating this thing, like you've got a solid three-dimensional model, but it's actually is moving from image to image to image as you rotate in every which way. And just because you've got to capture the form, we don't just do the ball itself. We do the ball by itself, but we also do the ball in the furniture, because that's how it was made and sold and so on. And because there are some freaks out there who like furniture, we do just the furniture by itself as well. And then you got the guys, there's a Japanese company who did the BNF maps, who actually take all these photographs. They do a photogrammetric modeling of the ball, because the ball is not actually a perfect sphere. It's man-made paper mache or plaster or something. And then they basically reproject those into a sphere that they have as a mathematical model, which you can then twirl and twist and do what you like for. So the BNF, Bibliothèque Nationale de France, their digital images to me look a bit flat because they've gone through this mathematical rendering. Our ones tend to be more, you can capture the sense of the sphericity because they're actually a straight photograph.
Interesting. Thank you. I think, let's see. We have someone asking if the copper plates that were used in printing early maps still exist in libraries or museums anywhere.
Yeah.
A few.
Yes. We have one at the Clements of the Battle of Yorktown. And it's very interesting. We've had it out on display, and so always interesting to see the famous map of Paris, the Turgot-Breton plan that Karl showed. The plates for that are in the Louvre, and they occasionally pull new copies from it. So copper plates, if they've been maintained, can last a long time.
The problem is that we keep having these things called wars, which will have bullets whose jackets are often copper, and so copper plates tend to get turned into
Melted.
bullets.
Yeah.
Lithographic stones, on the other hand, there are lots of those floating around, but they're just very heavy.
All right. Well, let's see. Tom is wondering if there are efforts to reproduce maps and different projections to fit and compare with other maps of the same area.
Yes, there are many projects that do this. There's some interesting things on some urban spaces. Paris is a good one, where a great many of the historic maps have been fit to a modern grid of the city. And indeed, have, where understood, those can be fit in a projection such that then that image can be changed. Now, sometimes these works, of course, become highly distorted and the text may be difficult to read, but that's certainly a useful way to do comparative work across a space where there are many changes that may be evident, especially in an urban space, but in other kinds of spaces as well. I'm an advocate sometimes for taking the original map that speaks to a particular time in history and take things back to that time. So fit the modern to the antique and not necessarily the other way around. Then it gives you kind of a different perspective on these things.
Well, that's an interesting take, Carl, because there's a practice. It's mostly post-Second World War, but it goes back at least to the 1910 of drawing distortion grids, of imagining where the lines of latitude and longitude would go over a modern map, and seeing which places they intersect with, and then redrawing the lines across but over a tracing of an early map, and you can see sinuosities and patterns of displacement and distortion.
Yes, you can find a lot of papers written on especially some early maps and the kinds of distortions that occur in those. The Bufalini plan of Rome comes to mind. That's been done. Other kinds of works as well, and it's kind of interesting. Yes.
So we also have a question about whether or not you need a different setup for atlases and books that are tightly bound.
Yes. Software helps to some degree, but you may support and have the book open at a very, very, very small angle. But frequently, it's impossible to see fully down into the gutter of that work. Sometimes the map or image on a plate is really, it's impossible to see it because it's become part of the binding structure. In those cases, you hope there's another copy out there that's not so bound in that sort of way. We have tended not to pull these works apart unless it's necessary to do to conserve the object, and we would have done that anyway. So there may be works like that where it's nearly impossible then to really pull out what's deep in the gutter of the book.
All right. Well, thank you. I think and thank you to everybody who has been joining us for these sessions and asking such good questions. Thanks so much, Mary and Matthew and Karl.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you.
It's been a pleasure to do this.
Yes.
Right. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you again.